My friends, before the show begins today, I wanted to share some big and exciting news and what it means for me and Conversing and for our listening community. Starting today with this very episode, Conversing is now jointly distributed by Fuller Seminary, as it has always been, as well as by Comment magazine. Adding this new partnership is an honor and a joy. Having launched Conversing in 2016 during the time that I was serving as president of Fuller Seminary, I'm grateful to say that the show will remain a part of Fuller's growing collection of educational resources. So this new joint partnership between Comment magazine and Fuller Seminary won't disrupt any of your listening experience. We'll still be right here in the same feed you're currently listening in, and with the added treat that we're going weekly. We'll, of course, continue to release my conversations with absolutely wonderful and fascinating people. But for weeks when we don't have a full conversation, I'll offer a new format of short personal reflections. It's my way of exploring some ideas and stories and questions and ponderings and perspectives that animate Conversing and give voice to the purpose and heart of the show. And to help me celebrate and announce this new partnership with Comment, I'm so excited today to be able to bring Ann Snyder, editor-in-chief of Comment magazine, for today's episode, as we dive into more about Comment, about its legacy and about its future, and about this exciting new development with Conversing. If you'd like to know more, visit comment.org/conversing. Thanks, as always, for listening. Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. I really am especially delighted today to welcome Ann Snyder as our guest on Conversing. Ann is the editor-in-chief of Comment magazine and oversees their partner project called Breaking Ground. She's the host of the Whole Person Revolution podcast and so much more. For years, Ann has been engaged in concerns for what she refers to as the social architecture that we live in. That is, the way that our practices of social engagement, life, conversation, discussion, debate, and difference can all be held in the right kind of ways for the sake of the thriving of people, individuals, communities, and our nation at large. She's a very experienced writer, having written for such publications as the Atlantic Monthly, the Washington Post, Bittersweet Monthly, and of course, her editorial work with Comment magazine itself. And thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a joy to be here, Mark. Thank you for having me.
As we get started today on Conversing, it's a great joy to be able to announce jointly that a new partnership has been formed between Conversing and Comment magazine. Ann Snyder, as I've said, is the editor-in-chief of Comment magazine, and it was really her great kindness and generosity that extended this invitation for this partnership to come to existence. And today, as we have our conversation, we're going to be discovering more about Ann, more about Comment magazine, more about the big project that is behind Comment magazine, and how and why the partnership between Comment and Conversing seems like such a natural and exciting fit. We've been friends for a number of years, and I've been a great admirer of your work in different domains, and certainly nowhere more than in the work that you've done with Comment. But I want to be sure that all of our listeners really understand more about who you are, more about your history, and more about what it is that you're really up to in this editor-in-chief role that you have with Comment. So first, just tell us a little bit about yourself, your formation as a child, and so forth. I've mentioned your degrees and places you've studied, but give us more a sense of how you were raised, because you were raised as an international yourself, and that feels like a very important part of your life story that I want people to hear.
Thank you. Thanks. Sure. So, yeah, I was born in the U.S. I was born in Boston, but when I was 4 years old, moved to Hong Kong with my family. My father was in a business called foreign exchange, currency trading. He worked for a Boston-based bank, but his wife, my mother, had herself grown up the daughter of Wycliffe Bible translators in the jungles of Peru. So I always joke that without having any real cognitive awareness of what all was going on, my early years were aesthetically formed by kind of Quechua indigenous artwork all around our home and the flutes and the lomo saltado and all that is Peru and the sort of a version of the Southern Hemisphere meeting kind of cosmopolitan. In this case, this is the 80s, late 80s, the clash between sort of the East and the West, and was the free market going to win out or not, was all kind of actually happening in Hong Kong in a really interesting way right at that moment. We moved, my parents, in fact, went over there looking for an apartment when Tiananmen Square occurred. So all of that was kind of an exciting time to be over in that part of the world with this, in some ways, a nuclear family formation that had strands of American in it, strands of this more sort of global Southern Hemisphere Christianity from my grandparents that was channeled through my mother, and then kind of in this more cosmopolitan world, relationally, socially. So obviously, I would not have been able to frame that at all in any coherent language when I was a kid, but I do think something both aesthetically and just in the curiosity and, even though it wasn't for my whole upbringing up until early teenage years, to be given such a cross-cultural set of exposures, it does something to you that you don't quite realize is forming you in a particular way until many, many years later. But that was sort of a beginning point.
Does that give you a sense of being a third culture person? Is it that deep and strong, or would you describe yourself that way?
I know my mother, as a missionary kid, does describe herself that way, and I've read some of those books. I think I feel a great sympathy with and just a kinship with third culture kids, but I think because we did move back to the States when I was still relatively young and not yet entering full teenage years, I'm not quite that full on.
Right.
I meet a lot of third culture kids who even these days, insofar as the language of trauma has become so much more ubiquitous, who will, even though they're grateful to have this cross-cultural experience, they'll often situate the dislocation that in a very profound way, and they'll use sort of the vocabulary of trauma. And I don't feel that way. I just mostly feel like I was given some unique exposure at a young age to what it is to be, a bit of a cultural minority in a land. And to sort of see the U.S. in particular from the outside.
Right.
But I love third culture kids, but I think they have more legitimacy than I.
And you have been a writer for a long time and now occupy this very significant role as the editor-in-chief of Comment. Tell people about Comment and its history, because that itself is very significant. But then please tell us more about this moment in your own role as editor-in-chief and what the vision, what the major project behind Comment really is.
Yeah, thank you. So Comment magazine was created a little over 20 years ago by a Canadian Christian think tank called Cardis, which is not as well known in the U.S., but is widely respected up in Canada. Something that sets it apart, certainly from most faith-based organizations I've come to know in the U.S., is it's very intentionally ecumenical, which I've always loved about it. So my colleagues up there include Catholics and Orthodox and various versions of Reformed, and the sort of Canadian evangelical thing is a different flavor than the American evangelical thing, but all of that is up there. And they're quite accustomed, because Canada doesn't have the civil religion in its bones that the U.S. does. They're quite accustomed to being kind of a creative minority in a very pluralist, secular public square. And they inhabit that with, I think, an uncommon amount of sort of intellectual hospitality and sort of a wink of mischief as they traverse their own they have different political kind of binaries and poles than the U.S. does. So there's some overlap. But I think they navigate that in a way I've just found like very, very compelling. So they started Comment. They're a public policy think tank that works on sort of a range of issues. They would now say the sort of sum of their mission is to provide fresh imagination for a thriving society. So that kind of doesn't immediately give away some of its like 2,000 years of Christian social thought that animates some of its priors as they think about family policy to end-of-life care to certain forms of urban design. But so they have had various programs over the years that are trying to think as holistically as possible around and sort of leveraging a Christian understanding of the human person to do pretty sophisticated policy research. And they started Comment as a way of forcing themselves not to get into kind of a ideological echo chamber. They had observed a lot of think tanks in the U.S., I think, get a little bit insular and start to create and publish a series of, white papers, have events where it became very predictable. And they thought we should set up an independent, almost like Skunkworks or
Right.
editorial shop that's asking the large cultural questions, find an editor who has pretty eclectic networks that is thinking specifically around Christian thought and how it can speak to a pluralist society. What are the questions some of the most like deep-seeing people of faith are asking about the broader society, not just questions facing the quote church. So Cardist published Comment originally for many years just for itself. So the sort of material that the magazine was producing, Cardist said, we're the primary audience, and if others start to eavesdrop, great, but that's not our goal. Those are not our success metrics. So fast forward, my predecessor was a wonderful philosopher by the name of Jamie Smith, who some of your listeners may be familiar with. He's written many, many books, very prolific. And he took Comment kind of into, I think, just more public domain a little bit. Cardist does, even though it's very ecumenical, some of its roots are in sort of this second, third generation Dutch Reformed immigrant heritage in Canada, very different from the Dutch in Grand Rapids, so we could get into that. But Jamie sort of took it into this slightly broader set of theological streams, really asking, I would call it like a series of Charles Taylor type questions around the nature of secularism. And then when they came my way in 2019, I had Comment really, I felt like not a daughter of the magazine exactly, but Jamie had found me somehow. I'd written something for a little communal blog I was a part of. This is like the late 2000s. And an editor at Comment had found my writing, thought it seemed like it was similar to the fragrance of thought. They pitched me. I wrote a piece, and Jamie wrote in the margins, like, Anne, I think you have a voice. You should think about doing this for a life, for a living. And I was really surprised. People had said, Anne, maybe you should think about writing, but I always thought writers seemed very miserable and antisocial. And I was afraid of being lonely my whole life. So I had refused those encouragements. But when Jamie said it, I was so honored and I just really appreciated the questions Comment in particular was asking me to explore around how do love and politics interact, to how do you think about being a person of faith who's pursuing truth through journalism, which is what I was doing at the time. And they were very like vocationally significant moments to clarify my own thinking and to integrate kind of my own sense of ongoing discovery of a calling. So when they came my way quite a few years later and asked me to consider serving as the editor and stepping into Jamie's very large shoes, obviously I was really humbled. I was a bit surprised. And then immediately I was struck by my own. On the one hand, I thought, well, I don't have a PhD. I'm not, I feel very theologically well exposed by the time they came my way, but I'm not a theologian. My background's more in philosophy and narrative journalism and reporting. I come from wide cross-section of cultural rapids. But I thought, I feel ambitious for this publication because I'm sensing more and more just spiritual hunger, at least in the Western world, and also a disappointing narrowness as to who gets to speak on behalf of the, quote, church to the broader public, and kind of a demographic narrowness, like the cultural and theological sort of silos that I'm not even going to, and we could name names, but who were kind of speaking with so much authority and great platform. And I thought, gosh, could Comment, despite our own, in some ways, the limited roots of this publication, could we bridge outward and serve as ultimately over time, I knew it wouldn't be a short game, a conversational organ and hub that shows unity amidst diversity within the church herself and the broader Christian community in North America. And then if we could get a little more global and just show a different form of witness that is not navel-gazing, that feels like it has a perennial, like generative way of creating new life in our public square in a very like increasingly fraught and polarized time, obviously. And could we do it with just a glint of sort of adventurously trying to bring together public intellectuals, of course, excellent scholars and thinkers, but also the people I tend to learn from most powerfully are doing redemptive work in very creative ways on the ground. So I just broadly call them weavers or practitioners, community shepherds, but those who are attuned to the pain points that, say, you might read about in the New York Times or you might read about or in the Atlantic, but are often in local ways and often outside of the walls of the institutional church, just creating communities, movements, and serving as sort of agents of healing and holding common ground. And they don't always have the words to describe their practice, but could Comment be a place that equips them, encourages them in what they're already doing, and also honors their practice in a way that is sort of the new public theology lived.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
I love that. Thank you so much for that introduction. For those who haven't been acquainted with Comment, I really encourage you to investigate it. One of the things that I think is so appealing to me about Comment and about the project that you've just described is that it does feel so resonant with the project that I would say is actually behind Fuller Seminary, but I think it's also behind Conversing itself. And I think it is this desire to give opportunity for voices to be heard whose stories, example, actual work on the ground, whose thinking, whose investigation, whose creativity, whose compassion, whose mercy, whose justice, whose faith is something that I am just eager for us to lift up. And some of the people that are guests on Conversing, as you know, are people that have a broad acquaintance with a larger public, and some are not broadly known, but are people whose voices, in that weaverly sense that you just described, are making real differences in local contexts. And I'm also eager for their voices to be lifted up. And I think it's because we're at a point where there doesn't seem to be any great listeners in the public square. It feels like it's mostly just talkers in the public square. And I think what your writers and you yourself and what the guests that I get a chance to interview and talk with on Conversing are doing is demonstrating that they are actually listeners, and that in their listening, they are taking seriously the stewardship of the realities that they become acquainted with, that they know personally, or that they can personally engage or serve or respond to in some way. And I think that to me is an enormously compelling thing. But it's that fragrance of conversation with people who are deep listeners that I think is part of our shared vision. So I guess for the sake of tying the two things together, it would be helpful, I think, maybe for Conversing's listeners to hear you, Anne, explain how you see Conversing being a complement, a partner to the work of Comment.
Yeah. Well, if I could run way into this just slightly, I've been thinking more deeply, even in the last 10 days, watching all these protests that are happening across the U.S. on our college campuses around Gaza and Israel. And I got caught up in a little unpleasantness last week while moderating a panel, actually. And the frame of the panel was the power of storytelling to mediate messy conversations. And long story short, because of everything happening in the Middle East, the room was very tense. I learned a lot from the whole experience, but I bring it up because these are seasoned storytellers. I asked them, when was the last time you heard a story that really woke you up, like woke you out of numbness, caused you to shift a paradigm? And I tried to ask it very gently, like no aggressiveness, or it wasn't a gotcha question. It was just an opening to try to put them from the other side. And and these are all lovely people, and maybe because I didn't warn them, they just went to their shtick. But I was really struck. In fact, one of them even said, I don't really like answering that question because I just want to be changing other people's minds. And then each of them kind of had their moment of proclaiming their, just even in the tone, I was like, oh, this is so ironic on so many levels.
Right.
So I just,
right.
something about it. And then frankly, how fraught this whole conversation became in the context of all that is rippling in. I'm talking to so many young people right now in particular who are literally telling me they don't actually see the value anymore of engaging with someone with whom they disagree, like actually openly wondering, why would I even talk to someone who has a different view than I on seemingly such a set of sort of sacred issues, or
Right.
it's like we've crept into that permission in our at least broader public atmosphere, maybe not with our own intimate relationships, where the mode towards charitable interpretation, towards genuinely listening and engaging in the jazz of human exchange and not having dead eyes, but being willing to understand someone else's pain and respond to it, understand why a certain view, all of that. I know it's cliche to say at this point, but it feels just so increasingly rare to not be behaving with one another as like individual kind of activists who have a statement to say. But I was reflecting on the timing of feeling very discouraged more recently, even more discouraged than I usually am by our public atmosphere in an election year, and just how grateful I am that we are partnering together and Comment gets to, frankly, just associate itself with a person, you, and I think your discernment in other people, but also the hospitable way in which you approach other human beings that is setting the conditions for people to really be in an even dialogue of discovery, of reflection, of honest, so often like lacking conclusiveness, is allowed to be bewildered out loud together. And so I just am so thrilled to be associated with a long-standing series of conversations, but also the fragrance with which you welcome people into a room to reflect on their own practice, vocation, sense of calling, what God may be doing in the world. And I just think something in the patient, slower, deeply gracious, but also intent on excavating something is really rare. So in terms of Comment, I say that so much of our work has either got to facilitate or itself is born out of encounters and exchange. And I view like the development of Christianity itself from the very beginning and now 2,000 years later as sort of constantly this exchange of between strangers and friends.
Yes.
And our own faith has sort of been shaped and chiseled by interacting with those outside of the tradition. So I think, in a moment when we live in a landscape just totally dominated by shortcuts and binary suspicion and, of course, fear-based narratives, and as you put it, just this sort of a pervasive lack of listening, like somehow listening itself seems to have become the latest threat to our own sense of solidity. I just think who you are and what you've done so far on Conversing is an exemplar of a different way to live, a different way to approach every other human being you come into contact with, and therefore in the dialogue to see, hopefully a little more widely, with a bit more charity, but also more clearly beneath the noise and beneath the warfare. So it's such an embodiment of what some of our perhaps more cerebral arguments or imaginative explorations in our pages, what Conversing is doing is such an embodiment of, I think, the kind of world we're trying to create.
I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. Well, those are very, very generous words. I do take them seriously because I do think that they are aspirationally what we're trying to do. And sometimes I think when we do it at our best, and what I hope we can contribute to Comment listeners who might take up listening to Conversing, is an interaction with both the expected and unexpected people who are themselves inhabitants of this practice, really, in their own regard. Yeah. And I think probably one of the things that probably does tie together all of the people who I have had as guests is that when they're at their best, they are listeners, and they take the stewardship of their own listening really seriously. It's like its own new form of resistance, you might say.
Oh, fascinating.
To be a listener, and therefore they come to the conversations that we have sometimes as a result of books they've written, or in any case things that they may have done in the world which have caught my attention or have been brought to my attention, and I think when that happens and you have a chance to explore those spheres, you let it unpack layers of realities that only really emerge in that kind of way. You might know that there's a really quite wonderful book out in the last couple of years written by Kreider that's entitled The Patient Ferment of the Early Church.
I love that book. Yes.
I know. It's such a wonderful book. And it does capture, I think, what you're describing, this long sense of letting the yeast of the reality of God, the loving character of the kingdom, the goodness of the gospel, to find its way in its catalytic implications and impact in a way it's described, I think, by that two-word phrase, patient ferment. It's just such a different strategy. A tactic is too strong a framing of it. It's not a tactic. It's a way of being. It's releasing a catalyst into the flower or into the world in a way that will over time do its patient work. And that's both the discouraging part, as in you were saying, when I think about the work of Comment, I think in so many of the same words, this is what you're doing in the magazine. And the guests and the writers that you have featured are people who are doing this same kind of work, which is why I think there's such a synchronicity between us. But also there's a sense that it's different to have it harvested in written form than harvested in recorded conversational form. And both have their place, both have their audiences. And I think we're hoping together that there will be some new cross-fertilization that may occur between the Comment magazine and Conversing podcast. So I think it's that long work, though, that I think were referring to when you said that the signs of discouragement of the wider public narrative. That is absolutely true, especially if you're taking a strategy that is more yeast-like and less war-like.
Yes.
It just is doing something really different. So,
Mark, would you mind if I, not to share my own shtick at all, but
Please.
Just in response to that, as I have tried to help Comment be, and sort of, it's obviously we're published by another larger institution, but I sort of think of Comment partly because we're so much larger in the U.S. than other countries, and yeah, we're more in the U.S. than Canada. I think of it as its own institution, and I've been trying to articulate a way of being. Yes, we're a magazine, which is a particular kind of entity, but we also really believe in institutional hospitality. And I just think broadly we're in a moment when, of course, I think most of us agree, we're kind of moving from institutions to networks, for better, a little for worse in some cases.
Right.
There's
Yes.
a need for uncommon collaborations, and how can we help weave a whole variety of, whether it's a podcast like this, associations, seminaries, social service agencies, like that broader quote social architecture, which is a phrase we use a lot. Is there a theory of change or a narrative that binds these organs and individuals together in common cause? So what you just said about yeast, I get accused very legitimately, but often by who I call the metaphor police, that I'm too in love with metaphor and I mix them up too often. But I've been trying to write down kind of our ethos, and I might just express it here because I think it helps explain. It's what I see in Conversing, and it helps explain why I think we're like family, like in our instincts, which is just an encouragement. So do you mind if I just read aloud these few sentences that I've been trying to put out to articulate?
I think it belonged to Jesus, so feel free.
Okay, yeah. These are, yes, okay, quasi-biblical. So I say this is not yet public, but it will be very happily public here. I say, our theory of change takes its cues from the garden, less the machine. We are personalists, not ideologues. We follow the logic of Jesus's mustard seed, of yeast transforming a whole pile of dough, of the principle of contagiousness and change happening over generations. We believe in the value of slow thought. We are skeptical of the language of scale when it comes to growing spiritual goods. While we wish to be savvy in unmasking the either-or reactivity of our age and will always call out dehumanizing trend lines, we are fundamentally animated by the creative impulse, by a philosophy of natality, bit of a new word for me lately, expressed through hospitality. And then the final sentence,
Nice.
which just I think tees you up, is this feels especially important in this time between eras when no one knows what's next, and we need one another to recalibrate, to reflect, and to shape a hopeful future. So that's my attempt at like a minor little manifesto there, at least in terms
it's
of
a beautiful
logic.
manifesto. It's a beautiful manifesto, and it expresses very well, very, very well, the simpatico connection. I think that again we share together personally as well as in the various enterprises that we're each undertaking. Thank you for sharing that. I hope that somewhere, perhaps on our show notes, we could, if that's a capturable quotation, that we could actually post it in some way. It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
Can I ask a couple questions about it?
Please, yeah.
So one of the things that is so magnificent about that phrase, which I've only just heard, but what just strikes me about it so much is that it is really setting up an ecology that is itself, it's cutting its own way, you might say, saying this is the ecology from which life emerges. That's in a way the underlying claim of such a way of stating things. And I share that. I think that is that we are talking about colliding ecologies where what various people have thought was life-bringing or power-bringing or notoriety-bringing or wealth-bringing may or may not be life-bringing. And what you've just described is one way of portraying what is life-giving. I wonder if you could just unpack that a bit more for everyone's understanding of what you've said, as well as just to hear your reflections on that theme.
Yeah, I think I probably, without quite realizing it, but became, I think I probably always had a bit of an allergy to, frankly, flat engineering or static engineering, metaphors, language systems. Some of that may just be generational. I've wondered a little bit if some of it is gendered, and also a little having not been formed in the West initially, and have always just been drawn, though I'm learning how to garden slowly but surely, but not a very good one. I've just always been drawn to horticultural metaphors, and I think metaphors that relate, frankly, and this makes some of my male colleagues uncomfortable, but where does new life come from? And like notions of sort of the womb, spiritual motherhood, how does that work itself out in the world? And some years ago, before Comment, I was asked to write a book about how character formation and moral formation is happening in 21st century pluralism. Is it possible to have morally coherent communities or institution when there's so many different visions of the good these days?
Right.
And that project, I'll never forget, this is a little name dropping moment, but I'll never forget I may have told you this, Mark, I was accidentally sort of put on standby of a flight early in the research for this project. At the time I was living in Houston, Texas, and I was visiting a couple professors on the East Coast in New England. And one of the universities happened to be Harvard. And I get on a flight late at night. I kept getting delayed, and I got put on standby, which wound up bumping me very oddly on the shuttle flight into first class, which I'm never on. And I sit down and I recognize this person sitting in this aisle, but I'd been in the big state of Texas for quite a few years. I'd kind of forgotten how small the certain elite corridors of the East Coast can be, and couldn't believe that who I thought this was who it was. So I didn't say anything. Anyways, this person we sit next to each other. He starts engaging me in conversation. halfway through, about 30 minutes in, I asked, he kept talking about Harvard. And I said, I was just there today interviewing these scholars for this project I'm doing about character. And then he kept talking about Harvard. And I finally said, sir, you seem like, even though I kind of was wondering if I knew who it was, I said, you seem like you have a lot of touch points with Harvard. Have you been an adjunct there? And he looks at me. I'll never forget this moment. He looks at me and he goes, would it mean anything to you if I told you my name was Larry Summers, who is the previous president of Harvard?
Yes, right.
/ Secretary of the Treasury. And in that moment, I had recognized him, but I couldn't believe that it could be him. So anyways, we actually have a lovely conversation. He was very engaging. And I bring him up just because he's a very economic mind. And he was very kind about he was interested in, character formation. You mean like the Boy Scouts? Or I was like, well, I'm not necessarily waking up in the morning to revive the Boy Scouts, but, trying to explain just my curiosity and who I was trying to unite around this common vision of sort of moral and spiritual formation. And he goes, such an economist sort of response. He goes, well, your job is not exactly easy, but I would say I hope this is a helpful frame for you. Your job is to find the McDonald's of character formation and just blast it out there. Clone it, get it scaled, make it global, find the template, find the cookie cutter of character formation, and just clone the heck out of it. And I must have been feeling sufficiently relaxed at that point by, frankly, just how human, and he was really wonderfully gregarious. And that I said, I still can't believe I said this, but I said, thank you, Mr. Summers, but that's kind of the complete opposite of what I think I need to do. And thankfully, the plane landed and I was saved by the departure and didn't have to defend my turf. But I say that to say it sent me then on what would become kind of a years-long quest or I felt haunted by this question, can love scale? And sort of what I meant by that was I was just noticing, because I was visiting such a variety of organizations and communities in our civil society, from neighborhood revitalization efforts to really interesting schools that were drawing people from every ethnicity and race and social class across a given city, and through sort of beauty and a real attentiveness to the science of relations and how that relates to how children learn, helping children feel seen and known. That felt, just like gorgeous little communities I think we would all want to be a part of, adult or child, to rehab organizations for people who'd been in prison for many years because of grave mistakes they'd made, and then finding themselves in certain kinds of radically sort of mutually accountable setups over years where they would just discover their own interior freedom and a sense of true north and what it is to be a generative citizen, to long-term recovery groups propped up after wildfires and natural disasters, to any kind of collective communal form where it really did feel like there was this beautiful dance between someone's own ongoing lifelong formation, either forming or sort of devolving, and then the mysterious conditions that are embedded in the whole, not the sum of its parts. Yes. I just became like, what is the language? I know how to tell these stories, or I was trying to. I was trying to narrate this yin and yang between moral agency and the conditions in a given context or community and across so many different sorts of spheres. But what's going on? These are not templated. This is not a McDonald's Happy Meal that can just be multiplied and disseminated. This is there's some sort of emergent process where we interact with our very particular environment with just a whole set of particularities, stories, wounds, the horizon of particular hope, goals, exemplars. And I think in just the complex alchemy of starting to really understand formation, and frankly, even thinking about my own formation, my own conversion story, I started just reading specifically, I think, Christ's method of, quote, social change and human soul change in a very different, well, at least in a way that felt so different from sort of North American programming and systems, including even in the church, the church throughout North America. So because of that work, which I became almost belligerent, frankly, about being anti-scale as like a way of asking, like, how do we improve our society? How do we change human beings? I wasn't belligerent, but I just became quite convinced that's the wrong way to think about
Right.
philanthropy and true transformation.
Right.
I went on a new search to at least try to find a language, and turns out I found it.
Yes.
I found a lot of it in the New Testament, and also in Judaism, and just sort of these ancient, more sort of peoplehood oriented ways of understanding us, always in dynamic relationship with particulars and with particular obligations. And something about that just is allergic to static listicles and 1 + 2 + 3 equal sort of formulas. And I continue to be on that search. Like, what is the language? How do we speak out of that more organic, deeply relational logic that I think is sort of at the heart of all that is created, and all that is new and unrepeatable.
Right. Part of what strikes me is that image of finding the way to McDonaldize character formation is the commodification of the project, as though it is about a commodity as opposed to a kind of being that gets formed in time, slowly and deeply. It's like the contrast that Michael Pollan has observed about our diet when he says that what we should do is eat food, by which he means something that our grandmothers or great grandmothers would have imagined was food. We should eat food, mostly plants, not too much. Now that way of understanding our food intake and its character is just completely different than the commodification, McDonaldization of character formation, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. Yeah.
Is this all part of what I've heard you refer to often and seems so central really to the backdrop of Comment, which is the recovery of Christian humanism? I'm not sure everyone has heard you speak on that topic. I wonder if you could just say a bit more about it. You've illustrated it really by the things you've shared, but say more about that phrase and why historically, theologically, biblically, it's so attractive and appealing to you.
Yeah, I've kind of fallen into Christian humanism, and I still use it with some tentativeness. I think particularly in this, say, American evangelical context, there's some baggage around the word humanism. These days, I think because I feel transhumanist and post-humanist and a variety of forces in both from technology, but also how we just talk about life and end of life and a lot of our political debates, I find that the sort of robust humanists, I'm right now talking to you from the University of Chicago, where I'm surrounded by many secular humanists, and I feel they're our friends. Like, I think we're in the same, we may not have the same ultimate telos, but there is a care somehow for souls, whether secular humanists would use the word soul or not. So anyways, I'm trying to navigate, because I am sensitive to some of my, say, own tribe having an allergy to that, and but partly I'm using it because it feels intriguing to people. I think partly also because the word Christian, sadly, in our part of the world has lost a lot of meaning, and so to just simply say, we are coming out of the Christian tradition, it just leads to, it feels like it offers no answers anymore, and that's an indictment, of course, on ourselves and our own witness. And, but I also just think a sort of a secular ear that associates that word with either politics or bigotry or, a lot of hypocrisy, all the things we both know. So Christian humanism, it is a long stand, as I understand it, and I really feel a student of it. I would point you to other theologians and historians who can speak much more eloquently on it. But the fundamental kind of view of this sort of 2,000-year-old emphasis within Christianity is that there's nothing about this that is overvaluing the overvaluing the human embodiment of Christ at the expense of his divinity. But a Christian humanist fundamentally believes that Christ himself was and remains like the ultimate measure of what it means to be human. So I think what I see in Christian humanism is a frame that believes that every human being is created in the image of God, whole persons who are at once sort of fallen, but also gloriously endowed, finite, limited, and dependent, but deserving of infinite dignity. And historically, Christian humanists, those who have sought to kind of sit within a Christian anthropology of the human person and ask, like, what is a human being and what is the measure of this, they have tended to work on four projects simultaneously, all of which I actually feel like comment in our limited but maybe ambitious way are also trying to continue. And that's a theological project, a kind of moral formation virtue project, that's a sort of political economy project, civic project, institution building, and aesthetic project. So sort of how do we like fundamentally understand Christ not as like some Superman, but also like the wonder and the woundedness of his own life this side of the veil? How does that impact the way in which we understand our own like becoming more human? So that's kind of the backdrop. And I have just found it to be, as I have enmeshed in all kinds of figures over the last 2,000 years who might have broadly fallen into, would have been fine with the label Christian humanist. It just sort of, it feels very rooted in a history, and something about the frame is, and I need to get better about really giving it a whole, so almost one-page definition, but it's really more of a way of engaging and a way of seeing your fellow citizens, whether they confess the name of Christ or don't. And I think has a lot of sort of canopy power, big tent power, both within the increasingly fractious Christian world, as well as so many today who want nothing to do with organized religion, but have become like very sort of attuned, whether to their own embodiment, to human pain, to human possibility and healing, who are actually kind of on a spiritual quest. And they're looking, I mean, I get a lot, I don't think my colleagues always like this, but a lot of people who are increasingly interested in comment, at least, and I think this is probably also very true for you in Conversing, are sensing kind of like a new wineskin emerging, like some emerging. I get a lot like, it's like emerging spirituality, which again makes a certain sort of more, quote, sort of conservative, certain sort of Christian person maybe nervous to hear. But I view that as there's nothing to be afraid of. Like, and if your feet are like deeply planted in a long-standing dialogue about, you know, why Christ came to earth, not just for the saving of souls for some eternal destiny, but for a kind of thy kingdom come here and now. I would love that to be as capacious a discovery process and search and quest and conversation as possible.
Right.
So I am finding Christian humanism, though it is sometimes shrouded in more mystery than is helpful and takes a long time for a non-theologian like me to unpack, I am finding it to be the most accurate articulation of as much a sensibility as like a philosophy.
I think that's such an important character of what you're doing. And it is at the backdrop of what Conversing is about as well. And it's another way of expressing why there is this connection and why the partnership that we're launching with this very recording actually is I think one that holds just so much promise. And there isn't anything to be afraid of in this context because of the nature of the God that we believe is the center of the enterprise, and because of if you want to use this word we've discouraged earlier, God's capacity for scale, which is always both universal and particular. And
yes,
it's in that particularity that the scandal of the gospel makes its greatest inroads and does its deepest work of transformation. And it's that proximity to grounded, embodied life that are the places, the communities, the contexts in which the kind of work and fruit that we're trying to encourage will be formed. So, and I really do want to say thank you so much for the invitation to join forces. Thank you for Comment's great support for Conversing. And I really look forward to the adventure that's going to be ahead, the people that we will come to know mutually because of these enterprises, and and the expanding audiences of people who I think are thirsty for something that is more like food than like plastic substances that we put into our mouth.
Yes.
And so I just want to say, here's to food, and let's provide it in as much abundance and wisdom and quality as possible. Thank you for being our guest today. And I know we'll have future conversations as well.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. It's really an honor and a gift. Thank you.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Laberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. Conversing is jointly distributed by Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Laberton. Thanks for listening with me.